Hello, and welcome once again to the Many Rules of Film Club. My name is Jeff. I'm the programmer at the Loft Cinema, and I'm joined, as always, by my very good cinema pals, occasional filmmaker Heather Lades.
Hi, Jeff.
And multimedia artist Rusty Boulay-Stevenson.
Listen to them, the children of the night. What music they make.
I predicted that.
Well, Rusty's doing his best Dracula, his best Count Dracula for a reason, I think, other than he wants to drain us of our blood. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't want to do that. I really don't.
Ew.
But if not that, then the fact that today we are looking at one of, I think, the most common Hollywood tropes, which is the remake. But we're not just looking at general garden variety remakes. We're looking at those projects which have been remade 3 or more times throughout Hollywood history. And there are a surprising number of those films that have been remade over and over and over again.
And they seem to have a common theme.
Common themes, literary adaptations.
Yep.
So maybe we should mention a few of them that are on this list of the most remade films in Hollywood. What do we have here? Great Gatsby.
Great Expectations, Huckleberry Finn, Jane Eyre,
Three Musketeers.
Jungle Book, Oliver Twist, Robin Hood. I almost did Robin Hood. I was tempted.
Oh, there's some good ones.
But then I also wanted to add Men in Tights, and that wasn't going with what our
Technically,
rules.
our rules. The rules of Film Club apply to this.
Yeah.
Yes, we're not looking at necessarily parodies and offshoots and sequels, but actual remakes.
Yeah,
Yes.
Sometimes that's a hard line to understand
Yes.
distinctly, but mostly we're trying to do films, not TV shows.
Right.
Not TV movies, but films that were made. Some others, Frankenstein's been made a lot. Kidnapped, Les Mis.
Some foreign films are the Three Godfathers.
Well, Brewster's Millions.
Brewster's Millions. Yes.
Which was weird because if you were a kid in the 80s, I saw it. It was Richard Pryor.
The Richard Pryor version, yes.
And I had no idea that that was the last Brewster's Millions. That was a theatrical release. And there was a bunch made in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So it was just weird. And they're all white men. And so here comes Brewster's Millions played by a black man. It's very weird. We'll cover that maybe at a later date.
Made during the decade of greed,
Yeah.
the 80s, and then that was it.
Yeah.
The Brewster's
Yeah.
Millions.
And it could tie into what we were discussing earlier is that some of what the remakes aren't made as much anymore. So,
Well, now we're in the era of the reboot,
yes.
which
Which
is
is a whole
different
nother
thing. It's a whole
genre.
different thing, yes.
Yeah, it's like
Another topic?
reimagining it. And this is like sticking more to the literary versions of what those
So why do we think literary adaptations make for the most frequently remade films?
because they become classics. Like, whether you want to agree with them being classics or not, I would say industry would say that they're classics.
Great Expectations.
Hamlet, Great Expectations, Oliver. These things are books that were well read by many or required reading in school. I was required to read Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol.
Sure, yes.
That kind of thing as a kid.
Great Gatsby's on every freshman reading list.
Yeah.
And just not to be too cynical about it, but Hollywood loves a pre-sold property, and
Oh yeah.
novels, I think, do not fall out of favor and style as quickly as films, especially the classics, because they do end up on those reading lists, and
And some of them are free, in terms of you don't have to get permission from the
That's right.
correct.
Some of them, not all of them.
Public domain,
Yeah.
a lot of them.
Yeah, some of them are. Sorry, that was the word. Some of them are public domain, not all of them, but those are cheaper to make than have to buy rights for. But
Plus, you like Jeff was saying, you're dealing with a known entity and a known quantity, and so film goers come in knowing they're going to see Huck Finn, knowing they're going to see The Great Gatsby, and so that familiarity lends itself to box office. It really does.
it should.
Right?
I mean, logically,
Generally
yeah.
speaking, yeah. I also think that every novel, when you read it, everybody gets a different sense from it. You know what I mean? The subtext for a good novel is going to be different depending on where you're coming from in life and how you're going to see things and how you want to see it, how you want to frame it. And so as opposed to something that was just a movie and there's this way that the movie was made, everybody, when they read a novel, they have different images in their heads, and it lends itself in that way to creativity because, maybe you didn't like the way it was interpreted before. And that's what we'll see in some of what we talk about with the films that we chose or the stories that we chose is that, they lend themselves to different interpretations.
Yes. And these classic novels that we're talking about, like Great Expectations and Jane Eyre, I think these become like our archetypal stories. They're almost like modern day mythology.
Yeah.
Because you can use them to fit different eras because they have themes and lessons and ideas that are relevant forever, depending on how you update them. So I think that's another reason, sort of the archetypal qualities. And also I think it poses challenges for if you're a filmmaker who enjoys a challenge, trying to reinvent something that people have seen dozens of times and make it relevant. That's a challenge that a lot of filmmakers enjoy.
The idea of reinventing or capturing a new audience, like for example, Pride and Prejudice. Like my Pride and Prejudice is Colin Firth's, but that's a TV version. But the one that they released earlier in the 2000s, I think, with Keira Knightley and I can't remember the guy who plays the lead. Some young women who are like 10, 15 years younger than me love that movie. That's not my favorite. So it's like recapturing a new audience as well as like trying to recapture the same audience,
That's a really good point. I mean, I really look at the Leonardo DiCaprio
Gatsby.
Sorry.
Great Gatsby.
Well, Great Gatsby, but I was thinking of Romeo and
Sure.
Juliet, right? Like that was all about bringing a new audience in. It was how do we make it a little edgier? And boy, now almost all movies are made that way, right? Like at the time, everybody's like, oh, it's the MTV version of Romeo and Juliet. And, it was really trying to update Shakespeare. And
it
I
did
too. It made me rethink. I'd read that story multiple times. I'd seen multiple movies made of it. That retelling of it made me reconsider some things about that.
Yeah, both by Baz Luhrmann. I think with Great Gatsby, he was also trying to do the same thing to take that out of the freshman reading class list ghetto that it had been stuck in for many years. And I think he did because it made it kind of cool and fun.
And making those old literature things accessible is what they were doing too. And so that's a whole nother, we could talk about that as just a whole podcast of revisioned remakes instead of,
And these also have an endless stream of new audiences because freshmen who are signed to read The Great Gatsby will instead rent The Great Gatsby Leonardo DiCaprio film or the Robert Redford version from the 70s.
Are you kidding me? I read The Great Gatsby, which is one of my favorite books of all time. Don't give me crap about it, but it is. And I watched the Robert Redford version, and I was horrified because it's horrible.
It's not a good adaptation.
Anyways, I enjoyed the recent Great Gatsby, even though it doesn't stick to the book like I would have liked. But
I think generations saw that version of Great Gatsby simply because that was the one that was available, and they had to read the novel, but they wanted to watch a movie.
Right.
So there's a guaranteed audience for it.
Yeah.
That's Mel Gibson's Hamlet, as far as that goes, too, right? I mean, that was an attempt to, not a good movie.
No.
But it was an attempt to make it accessible to a different generation.
I mean, and there's some, that's true. We'll see what's interesting, like how things are revisioned or seen differently or given to new actors for like Hamlet, because I'm sure we're doing a Hamlet and or something like that.
And we're in the era where we're now thinking about diversity and
yes, Lord, if there's a new Hamlet with all just white people, no.
Diversity and equity, like let's cast a woman as Hamlet, cast a black woman as Hamlet. I mean, now I think we're in a phase where we can do that a little more easily than even 10 years ago. So I think there's going to be some interesting remakes coming our way.
I hope so, and I hope that they're more than just. Even though I enjoyed the research for this podcast, like making different stories classics or remakes and would be cool too. So.
Yes. Well, so thinking of one of probably the most oft remade films, I know, Rusty, you were kind of a fan of Dracula.
Yeah, I am. I also kind of overdosed on Dracula. in preparing for this, and I really wanted to watch a couple more, but once I'd watched 6 or 7 of them, I kind of got to the point where I'm like, okay, enough of Jonathan, enough of Lucy. I've had it with all of them. I also reread the novel. Bram Stoker wrote it in 1898. It came out, and it wasn't a huge hit. It was a critical success. There were other authors that really appreciated what he did with it. And it's a fun read. Even for a modern audience, I find it to be a really fun read. Once you get about halfway through, it's an absolute page turner. It's hard to put down. I read it the first time when I was a senior in high school, just on my own, and then I read it again now. And each time, it's just a great read and really fun. And what happened first is in 1922, the German expressionist F.W. Murnau made a silent version of Dracula, but because it had only been written 24 years prior, there were still copyright issues with it. And so they tried to get around the copyright issues by naming the movie Nosferatu. It's Count Orlok, who's Dracula instead of Dracula. They never use the word Dracula. You do hear the word or they do say vampire, and you see it. It's a silent film, so you don't hear it. But it's a really great film, and everybody who's ever watched, if you've watched like the Academy Awards and they show some series of clips from movies and classic movies, you are going to see and recognize clips from Nosferatu. From this, it's considered one of the great silent films of all time. It's genuinely haunting. I mean,
very creepy.
Yeah, the man who plays the Dracula character, Max Schreck, that guy, he's creepy looking as all get out. When he's carrying his own coffins and stuff, like that's pretty neat.
He's got that
scary.
Nose and like the hands
and the bat ears
like everything about him is just iconic, and everything about the movie is iconic. If like I had my 11-year-old try to watch it with me, he got bored pretty quickly. Silent films are tough. You almost have to be in the mode of watching silent films and getting into it. We did a silent film episode, and that was fun to do. But it's tough to go back and watch some of these, even though this is iconic and it's a classic film. I don't know. I wasn't riveted, I guess, in watching it. Is all I would say. It's obviously very important to see. If you're a film buff, you need to know that and have that as something you've seen. They in trying to get around the copyrights, they changed up the story. They made a plague of rats as what people thought were causing the bites on the neck. They just changed up a lot of the characters and how they acted. It didn't work, though. They lost the copyright lawsuit. Bram Stoker's estate, led by his wife, his widow, fought the film in court over copyright issues. The film lost, and all the copies were ordered to be destroyed. So we almost didn't even have that. But it had been distributed so widely across so many countries that they couldn't destroy all of it, which is great. It leaves us with this amazing classic film. It's, again, way worth checking out. It's not the best of the Dracula movies that I saw. I saw 6 or 7 of them, like I said, but I bet it's in the top half.
But it laid the groundwork for the,
for everything else that came. And as I was watching it, and my wife and I talked about it, she pointed out that like so much of the Dracula stuff really became, after a while, especially after a few decades, became almost like fan fiction. So that it's all these different takes on what Dracula could have been. He becomes, by the 70s, he's much sexier, right? And then by the time you get to the Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola, that is like sizzling with sexuality. It's just
sizzling, yes.
Right?
Because Max Schreck in Nosferatu is not sexy.
Ew.
No, not at all. He's
horrible.
Like you said, he looks like
he's a human rat.
A rat or a bat, somewhere in there, right?
Yes.
And just to point out too, Bram Stoker was not the first to write about vampires. He's the first that brought in the name Dracula, and he seemed to have been interested in that. The Vlad the Impaler was a little bit on his mind but probably not as much as, like, he didn't know historically as much as we do now probably about Vlad the Impaler. But it definitely was on his radar. So I watched that one. That's the second time I've seen it. I really enjoyed it. Much more so than probably the most famous Dracula movie, which is from 1931 with Bella Lugosi. Heather, what you said is, you're like, if I watch it through the lens of Ed Wood watching it, it's fun. Yep, that's it. But otherwise, such a stylized version of Dracula. It's all about these weird looks, and it focuses on Bela Lugosi's eyes and on his hand a lot. And
heavy-handed with
my gosh.
And it's kind of creaky and stodgy. And I love the director, Todd Browning, a lot, and I love Bela Lugosi. But this version is not really fun to watch.
No.
It's kind of a slog.
Yeah, and there's no self-referential. There wasn't that at that time.
No, it was too early for that, maybe.
Yeah, there wasn't any more depth than that. Just in-your-face vampire.
Yeah.
Like, you know.
And there are a couple moments in it where it's kind of comedic too, I think kind of intentionally, and then there are lots where it's comedic for a modern audience because it just
unintentionally.
It's unintentional, and it is. It's slow and plotting and not very fun to watch. It does not make for an interesting watch at all.
Right.
Interestingly, though, and this is one that I didn't get to that I really wanted to, is Dracula in 1931. There was a Spanish version of it made essentially at the exact same time as the Bela Lugosi version. And though I haven't seen it, it gets really good reviews. It's considered a superior film to the Bela Lugosi one. Jeff, you've seen it, right?
I've seen it. I love it. And it's interesting, they were using the same sets and the Universal Studio sets, and they were using the sets at night when the other American version wasn't shooting. So it was kind of done almost like in a clandestine fashion. And it's a Mexican film. It had a Mexican film crew and Mexican cast. And it's much, because I think censorship laws were different in Mexico than in America. They could get away with a lot more. And they deviated more from the original story, and it was a lot more exciting and spicier, a little more sensual, a little more violent. Definitely interesting to watch them back to back, and you can see the same sets, but different actors on them.
The disc I have of Dracula has both copies on it, and that's how it's packaged a lot too now. And there are lots of Dracula packs where you can get multiple Dracula movies and a making of sort of thing too. And that's one thing about the Nosferatu. There's a really cool making of where they go and look at a lot of the sets and stuff and some of the cityscapes, and that's kind of cool to look at and see how some of it's still around. It still like looks the exact same, and then other parts of it look so very different and aren't even around. 1958 was the horror of Dracula, and that stars Christopher Lee. And that's a more entertaining than the Bela Lugosi version. Again,
Definitely.
Yeah, it definitely is, and it again starts now playing up more of the sexier vibe of Dracula, right? Because there is, it depends on how you look at the story, but there's a lot of homoeroticism for sure in it.
That's true.
Bram Stoker likely was gay, even though he was married. Oscar Wilde was tried for like homosexuality, and Bram Stoker stood up for him. At the time in the late 1800s, semen and blood were kind of interchangeable as far as how people thought of them. And you have Dracula holding the guy Jonathan in his castle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right?
And he always has a traveling companion named Renfield with him.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he's
In
always
quotes, traveling companion.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also the sexuality of Dracula going after these women, and obviously it's a little bit about the times, right? So women were obviously virgins before they were married, and so you have in the story of Dracula a marriage that happened super quickly in the hopes of stymieing Dracula from going after the woman, right? No, I get it.
No, yeah, I get it.
But so there's a lot of subtext there that, again, depending on where you're coming from and how you want to see it, there's a lot there. There's a lot there to sift through. The 70s saw like the height of like vampire and Dracula movies. In 1974, Blood for Dracula was made. It was produced by Andy Warhol. Udo Kier is in it. It is almost softcore pornography. Very softcore. It's like people, it's like a child's idea of what sex is, and just naked bodies rolling around a lot of times. It almost doesn't look like
can
sex
you just
ever.
like roll around together? No,
But it's hilarious.
No, like private shown.
No.
Just roll around
And very gory.
and make noises.
Really bloody.
Very bloody, because Dracula, so this time, rather than going to London, he and his traveling companion go to Italy, because things have changed so much that there aren't many virgins, or weirgins, as they're called in the movie.
Yeah.
And so they put the coffin up on top of the car, and they go on a road trip to Italy and looking for virgins, and they hear of this fine family with 3 women, and they've raised 3 girls, and they've raised these girls as Christian, so they're probably virgins. No, they're not. There's a woodsman who helps take care of the property,
who takes care of them too.
Who takes care of them too. Lots of breasts are shown. There's one shot in particular where the woman's breast is very awkwardly just left in the shot for a very long time.
Sure.
It's so weird.
I just like boobs.
Yeah, right. Just boobs. It's really funny, though, in lots of parts. And, and these girls, turns out they're not virgins, even though Dracula's hoping they are.
And my favorite thing is that when Dracula takes a bite of those non-virgins, he ends up having to vomit all the blood out. Because
they're not pure.
Because tainted blood makes him sick, and it just goes on and on, the vomiting and the vomiting.
Lord.
And,
this is such a man story.
It's gratuitous. Oh my gosh, is it a man story?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's funny though, and it kind of became my favorite of the bunch, just because it was such an offbeat take on it. Again, it's from 1974. Essentially, the movie Once Bitten takes that storyline, twists it up, and has a female vampire
throws Jim Carey in it.
Yeah, with Jim Carey.
Yeah.
And so some things play out kind of similarly. I really enjoyed it. And then, as you pointed out, Jeff, when we were talking earlier, there's also a scene where Dracula's getting hacked up, a la the knight in the Holy Grail, the Black Knight in the Holy Grail.
I swear Monty Python saw this film before they made Holy Grail.
Yeah.
Possible.
Yeah.
It definitely plays as if that's the case. I mean, it's so ridiculous. But, it's on Criterion, which will make you feel better if you start feeling like it's softcore porn that you're watching. You're like, but no.
It's art house.
It's art house.
Just embrace it. High art, low art.
Don't be ashamed of the softcore porn.
It's funny. And yeah. Oh, and I should point out that the woodsman, I love this, that class becomes such a big part of this movie. So the 3 daughters, the mom is ready to marry them off to this count, even though they're like, well, but he looks sick and like he's not even going to be alive for much longer. And look how white he is. And he's old and we don't want to be with him. And the mom's like, nope, this is your chance to marry a count from Transylvania at that. Yeah. He's got to have lots of money. Our family needs money. Our estate is falling apart. And so the woodsman is a Marxist. And he never says it. It's always just this Dracula even accuses him. He's like, I believe you've read certain books. And he's obviously referring to the Communist Manifesto. And so it all becomes about class to the woodsman. And he's always bringing that up to the women, and they don't want to hear it. But it's funny.
And the woodsman's great because it's Joe D'Alessandro who keeps his Brooklyn accent. They don't even bother. I mean, it's such a weird movie.
Okay, I think I have to go watch this.
You do.
Yeah.
You do have to. It's really worth it. It's wild.
He keeps his Brooklyn accent.
He just keeps it.
I gotta watch this. Not just the blood and all the soft core porn, but
The
I want to see
Brooklyn
the
accent,
Brooklyn
yes.
accent. Yeah.
Yeah, and the Marxist
And the
woodsman.
Marxists, yeah. Oh,
it's
all
worth
right.
it.
You sold me on it.
And Udo Kier.
And Udo Kier, the great Udo Kier.
So you get all of that, all in one place.
All right.
And then in 1979, there were 2 Dracula movies made. One by my friend, Werner Herzog. He made Nosferatu. He remade the silent version. And so it really is a take on the original Nosferatu movie and not Dracula. So it's this one that tried to get around copyright issues. And so it's got the plague, which of course Werner Herzog's going to have a plague in his movie. And all sorts of stuff. It's really great. I mean, I was really glad. I had never seen it before, and I was glad that we did this episode, so I got a chance to see it. It's worth checking out.
And it feels like a silent film.
Yes, very much.
Even
it
though
feels
it's
like
not.
a silent film.
Yes. He really sort of pulled that off, dialogue, but making it feel silent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's clear. I mean, even if you didn't know who Werner Herzog was, it's clear that this person is steeped in cinema and in a love of cinema. And he clearly loved that movie Nosferatu to remake it 50 years later. It's way worth checking out. I really enjoyed it. But what I enjoyed more, which is weird because I really like my friend's movies, but John Badham made a version of Dracula in 1979 as well. And this one really plays up the sexiness of Dracula. Who's the actor, Jeff?
Frank Langella.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was very handsome as
He's a very
young
handsome man. Yes.
And so it plays up the Dracula sexiness. That starts oozing out of it more. He looks really good. He does not look like the 1922 Nosferatu at all. And it's updated as well, which I think is really cleverly done. It's, again, the cool thing about all these remakes is they start drawing out these different ways of thinking about why would a guy go to Dracula's castle. Well, it turns out he was a vampire hunter. Is why Jonathan was going, and he was doing it under the guise of doing research, but really he's a vampire hunter and he wanted to hunt Dracula.
Maybe he found Dracula sexy. He just didn't say anything.
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe that's it.
Subtext.
Way worth checking out. It holds up so well for being from 1979.
And Sir Laurence Olivier is in it.
Yep.
And giving a
Oh,
great
I
performance.
didn't know
Yeah,
that.
it's a classy production.
It really is.
Yeah.
The set design is really great. I love the costumes in it. I'm not going to say it's the best Dracula movie, but boy, if you're getting ready for Halloween and you want to watch a Dracula movie, that's almost the one I recommend.
Yeah. From the director of Saturday Night Fever.
That's right.
That's why it's so weird. It's like the next movie after Saturday Night Fever is like, oh, well, they're kind of similar in a way. I mean, because you have these kind of charismatic sexual men sort of.
Yeah.
I have a whole theory about this. This is another podcast probably,
Yeah.
but
Interesting.
yeah.
Interesting. And then I'll wrap up with probably what's the best Dracula. It's Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola from 1992. There's so much great about it. The casting, though at times odd.
Keanu Reeves. Love him. Weird casting.
Weird casting at times, but then brilliant casting at times too, with Tom Waits as Renfield. Like, that's inspired right there. I think that's really great. You've got Gary Oldman, and it's really a great film. And this one amps up the sexuality to 11, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it just really, it infers a lot more than what the book had in it, even though they call it Bram Stoker's Dracula. Though it does, by and large, stick to keeping the characters in the place that they were, as opposed to changing them or changing their occupations or changing their motivations. It really does take Bram Stoker's base and build from that. And so it's a pretty good, solid adaptation that stays true to its source in many ways, even if it blows the sexuality up a lot. And the Count looks very different.
It's a good look. It's like a mix of Nosferatu and Count Dracula.
Yeah.
That's true.
Because he kind of looks like an animal, and he's got the weird beehive hairdo and the long fingernails,
You're like,
and
not what to make of it. You're like,
Yeah.
it's odd. And all the practical effects. I love all the practical special effects. which were,
Visually
I guess,
stunning.
based on the Murnau film, like using those same techniques.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It freaked me out from the trailer. I was still like, well, I don't know if I want to watch this movie.
Yeah, it's a very unusual film.
It really is an unusual film. There are real moments in it that are cinematic genius. It's the best of the Draculas, even if it's not my favorite of the Draculas. Boy, when it came out, though, I loved it. It's weird.
Yeah.
It's weird what a mixed reception that movie has had to me. And I guess part of it's because you do have Keanu Reeves and some strange casting at times. But by and large, it's gorgeous looking. The sets are really amazing looking. The camera works great. The subtext is brilliant, the way it's brought out and teased out. It's the best that I've seen of the Draculas. There are so many more, and that's when it really does become fan fiction. Had it not been for Nosferatu and Bella Lugosi and doing that, we never have Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Anne Rice
Or Twilight.
Right?
Or even Twilight.
And everybody having their own take on it and their own way of thinking about it. And I love that. I love that. And so, yeah, the vampire story I really love. I love the Dracula story. And those are a few of the Dracula films you can find. There's Dracula in Space.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
Is that Dracula 2000 or 3000?
2000.
2000.
Yes.
But so there are all different ways
There's so many like different kind of comedies, horrors, dramatic.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Almost the original, being remade multiple times. I mean, it was made in 22 and then it was made 9 years later.
And
1931,
and the Dracula story has been very open to gender swapping, which I find interesting. There's many vampire films, Dracula films with a woman playing Dracula, which I think a lot of monster movies do not do that. Like, I haven't seen a lot of female Frankensteins, for example.
Sure.
That's a good point.
But I think because of the kind of open sexual subtext of this, it can fit either a male or a female.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point because the sexual subtext is very open to interpretation, as we've discussed. It's really interesting. I mean, in the book, Jonathan wanders around the castle, and the women, his like ghouls or his people he's turned into vampires. These two women find Jonathan, and they're gonna like bite him, and he's like, no. He comes in and saves Jonathan. He's like, no. You can have this, and he throws them like a child. But
I forgot about that.
Jonathan is for me, right? And so there's a lot there that is definitely in the subtext that you can interpret a lot of different ways.
Which we can go with for a long time.
Yes, yeah. I think we'll have another Count Dracula adaptation soon. It's been a few years.
It's been 20 years.
20 years. So another very, very frequently remade story, although not for quite a while, is Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol.
Yeah, okay, so if you Google, most remade movies, Scrooge / A Christmas Carol, based on Charles Dickens' novel, is the top one, based on theatrical releases. And I was really surprised by that. I don't know why I was surprised by that, but I was. I read it as a kid. I think I read it at the same time as I had to read Oliver Twist. And so then I read A Christmas Carol. And I mean, Dickens, of course, he's a classic, but damn it, he's depressing. But A Christmas Carol is one of the ones that, in the end, it should make you feel good in a way, because he realizes the error of his ways. But I mean, I think most of the people, I don't think I need to explain the story. Ebenezer Scrooge, that's where we get when you call someone a Scrooge, from, because they're being not fun and not free with their resources.
That's right. That's right.
That's where we get bah humbug from. Had it not been for that book, I don't think anyone would ever utter bah humbug in 2019. And when we're recording this, it's December, so I still think A Christmas Carol is kind of one of those that you could watch any time of year, because it is like this all around make you feel good in the end story. So there's, I think, 8 theatrical versions of A Christmas Carol / Scrooge. Wow. I decided to pick the ones that stood out to me. The earliest one of the earliest ones is from 1930. 1935. And that one is a creepy, like it was originally black and white, but they went and colorized parts of it later. And honestly, that's the creepiest version, one of the creepiest versions,
Agreed.
because that version of Ebenezer Scrooge is interesting because I think that version is the closest to the Dickinson's character, the Dickens character, because he, in other versions of A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer, he may be this stingy person, but he's still kind of dressed well. You know, he shows that he's rich and etc. But in that version, he's like even scuffed up on his face. He's a little dirty. He's unkempt. So not only does he have this stinginess, stubbornness to him, he's that way with himself. He's, you know, doesn't take care of himself because why would you do that? His focus is on his job and making money. So there's that part of the story that doesn't kind of follow through as the other remakes. But the effects, even though they're so old school, they are so creepy. Like, I don't even know how. I think I remember watching this version as a kid with my grandma, and it was like a midnight movie or something on late on television, and being so scared.
It's nightmarish.
I was like,
yeah.
I mean, I got as a kid what they were the message that they were trying to portray, but like the ghost freaked me the hell out. Like, it was just is it Bob?
Yep.
Robert Marley, character when he comes back, the first ghost to haunt him, and you're like, he has he's carrying these locked things, and it's because, you know, they want it to represent like he let money and all of this wealth bring him down, and so he's there to teach, you know, Ebenezer Scrooge a lesson, and that was one of the scariest scenes, and I'm sure it was, you know, obviously because how they shot it. But the 1935 one, so the other thing is, surprisingly, these are not so the two places I found these online are, there's a lot of them on Amazon if you have Prime, which I know Amazon's not the greatest, but they are a really good resource for old movies. A lot of these, and a lot of them are on YouTube. So if you want to watch it for free and you have YouTube, go check them out. But this 1935 one is on both, I think. And it just creeped me out. I watched this at home with my big television and the surround sound. It totally creeped me out. The other version that is usually rated the best version is the 1951 black and white one with Alastair Sim, British cast, shot in England, London, I think. It's the most, I would say the most well acted of the bunch. You believe it. But if you're a cinematography fan, which I am, it is like some of the most beautiful black and white film shot. And I don't know, I just really enjoyed watching it. The acting is great. The photography was excellent. The ghosts were creepy too. I watched a couple others, like the George C. Scott one, which it's only good. That one is from, I think, the 60s, or the 70s.
I think early 70s, yeah.
That one's only good because of George C. Scott. It doesn't take advantage. Part of the reason why A Christmas Carol is so great in black and white is because it's creepy and the ghosts are creepy. It's really not like, I mean, I get why as a kid I read it, but it's more of an adult tale anyways. I mean, it's really, you know, it's a humanist tale about, you know, don't be greedy and stubborn, open your heart and open that other people need help. And I kind of look at it as and it's you know, so Charles Dickens wrote this in 1843. And that was during the early Victorian capitalist days. And so there was so much poverty back then. And I think as I watched all these versions of A Christmas Carol and how they changed over time, is they didn't focus, like in the earlier ones, you saw the poor children and how they suffered of really truly like dying because of hunger or having no parents and living in the street, and how we are here today in 2019 and we have those problems, but we don't see them like they used to see them all the time. And sure, it might not be that bad. You know what I mean? Like not every person or every city is going to have that situation. So I think as the times have gone on, the Christmas Carol has changed, you know, like that Patrick Stewart, which is not It was a good one, but the Patrick Stewart 1999 one was a BBC version, so technically not a theater one, but was good, and he's excellent. But it didn't really capture the feeling of the earlier movies where the children were like suffering. And the scene when I can't remember which ghost it is. Is it the ghost of the present? Anyways, when he whips open the robe and you see the two kids that are like emaciated and suffering, like that gets me every single time. And I think like just as time has passed, it's gotten less and less when the versions have been remade.
Well, it's a story about class, right?
Right.
And I don't think we're very comfortable now, film-wise, addressing class issues as we were in the 50s,
for sure.
the 40s.
I think we've wanted to even out the playing field because you buy into the story of that we all fight to even out the playing field. This is the world we live in, but that's really not the world we live in at all. And that the playing field is hugely uneven. We just want to buy into the fact that we all have a chance to get there. But the truth is that that's not the case because not everybody's playing field is the same.
Right.
And so I think that's also why, and I wish, I mean, the other version that I really enjoyed was, surprisingly, because I'm not an animation fan, but the CG animation, the Disney Christmas Carol with Jim Carey from 2009, which did not do well at the box office. Did okay, but not great. And it's not like one of on the people's list of like, oh, that's my favorite. Is my favorite overall one. And it's my favorite overall one because they took a little bit of liberty with the story where when he was traveling in the nightmares with the ghosts, there's a little tangents of those where they take advantage of the animation and he like part of the story he gets to be mini like a mini Scrooge and it's more action packed than a regular live action. And Jim Carrey does an excellent job voicing. He voices one of the ghosts. I can't remember which one. Gary Oldman voices Cratchit, and then the voice of Marley. It's an excellent cast with the voicing, and I think I have a hard time because it's that Disney animation that kind of it's better than, I don't know what it's called, but it's like a better version of the Polar Express, where the Polar Express animation was like dead eyes.
Ugh.
And so this
Dead
is
doll eyes.
the way better version of that. This is what the Polar Express animation should have been. And so it's a great animation, but I had like, after like the third, fourth minute, I got used to it.
Is it motion capture?
It might have been.
Yeah,
I should have looked that up.
Yeah.
If it's motion capture animation, then that's why.
Yeah.
But I didn't get stuck like I did in Polar Express, where I was like, "You ruined one of my favorite books."
Oh, yeah.
But this one, I was stunned that I enjoyed it so much. I loved it. I would watch it again next year or at any time. Honestly, I think this is one of the few stories that I could watch any time of year.
Did you rewatch The Muppets Christmas Carol?
I did.
I love it.
I loved it. It was fun.
Yeah.
I did not like the Bill Murray Scrooge for some reason. It just doesn't hold up, and it's not his best. The two things that are good in that are Carol Kane and
she's great,
and Poindexter.
Buster Poindexter.
Buster Poindexter. Those are the best things about it.
Yeah.
It just wasn't. Yeah, it took away. It didn't have what I wanted in it, which is like really showing you how you could be a better person. It just kind of was like Bill Murray being sad because he lost his love interest, mostly, not really about that he treated people poorly, and that he needed to change that. Anyways, it's like, sure, it's a very moralistic, humanistic kind of view, but I really appreciate it. I think it's great. I think more people, I hope that A Christmas Carol has kind of a resurgence. People get back to it and like understand the heart of it, that's what it's about. It's not just about the potential comedy of it. It's about like, maybe if we can, now that we're in 2019, we can mix it up and make, there have been other Scrooges where, the women or different diversity of Scrooge and all that kind of stuff. So, and heck, the DuckTales, Scrooge McDuck, which was one of my childhood favorites. But I feel like if we can mix it up, make it a woman, make it whatever, I don't know. Make it a vampire who's also Scrooge. I don't know.
Why not?
I feel like we've let society kind of hold us back with all of our storylines. Let's just make something, sure, it doesn't have to be a heavy-handed moral story, but something that makes us look at how we are now, And I think Christmas Carol would be a very cool way to do it. Just an updated version. You could still have that kind of, who knows? Make it a startup and have Scrooge be the head of a startup and Cratchit be one of the guys programming at the startup. And, you could do any of that and do it like in a really cool way.
Make him be the president.
Yes.
Yes. And crazy CGI effects. You could do the ghost in a really kind of amazing way.
Yeah. And so anyways, I think Christmas Carol is very cool. You should check out one of the remakes. It's worth watching.
Or if you're homesick on a Sunday afternoon, just in December, watch the Hallmark Christmas channel.
Yes.
This is a weird thing, but I feel like a lot of the Hallmark Christmas movies are now the Christmas Carol, but it's always about a woman who sort of learns to not be so driven and workaholic, and she goes back to a small town and she kind of reconnects and she realizes she needs to be nicer.
So it's kind of like, that's messed up. That's kind of like anti-feminist.
It's very reactionary, which I find interesting that they're so popular.
Right. Because they're like, we don't want you to be the loud, angry, business-like woman. We want you to be the friendly woman who goes back to the small town and falls in love and has children.
Yes, but it's interesting that it is sort of filtering A Christmas Carol through this kind of backlash feminist perspective.
Yeah. Interesting. That could be a whole nother podcast.
It's a whole thing.
So I think as we've talking, the whole remake thing is like there's so many genres, so many kinds of things and attempts you could look at it. And that's why I think they're remade, is because they have such potential in their storylines too. Like, I think it's sure that they're literary classics often, but I think they have such great storylines that you could translate that into, so many different kinds of class, culture, diversity. And I hope that, that we do, that people start doing that more often,
Yeah. Well, definitely the kind of multiplicity of meaning, I think, is definitely why we remake classic projects. And to me, like one of the ripest is Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is one of my favorite horror sci-fi stories. It's based on a Jack Finney novel from 1954 called The Body Snatchers, which was considered kind of like a pulp novel at the time, probably not like classic literature. But it was made in 1956 as Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the Don Siegel film, which I think is considered probably one of the classic sci-fi films ever.
For sure.
And I think everyone pretty much knows the story. Pod people come to Earth, extraterrestrials take over humans, turn them into something less than human, but a quote-unquote perfect version of a human, drained of emotion and feeling. And so I think the story really taps into our general fear of our humanity in society and how society sort of takes humanity away from us. And to me, what's interesting about The Body Snatchers is the way it gets reinterpreted about every 15 to 20 years, sort of examining whatever the social anxiety we're having at that moment is. In the 50s, of course, it was a metaphor for McCarthyism and the fear of communist infiltration, set in a small town, a fictional small town called Santa Mira, California. Very idyllic small town, but people start noticing people are changing. He's not my husband. He looks like my husband, but he's not my husband. Yeah. And nobody can really figure out why exactly. And then, of course, it's uncovered that it's pod people, and they're putting pods next to people. And it's always
this thing in my yard.
Yes, I found this thing in my yard. I took it into the house. And it always takes you over when you sleep. That's the recurrent theme in all the versions of Body Snatchers, which I think is an anxiety that a lot of people have, like what happens when I'm sleeping, what happens to your body, you're aging, it's very rich, the story of this. The original Invasion of the Body Snatchers, of course, is kind of famous for having a troubled ending. The ending originally was Kevin McCarthy, the hero of the film, uncovering the plot, this sinister alien plot, ending with him racing down the freeway yelling at people, "You're next, they're here." And you see truckloads of pods driving to cities. And of course, the studio that released the film said, that is a terrible ending. That is way too cynical, way too scary, way too pessimistic. So
where's our happy ending?
Where's the happy ending? So they forced him to reshoot an ending in which the character is basically proven correct because the FBI finds a truckload of pods, and so they believe him. he says, "Oh, thank goodness, now we can fight the pods."
So there was hope at the end of that version.
And in the 50s, that's how we had to think, that there was hope against the communist threat, which is, like
Right.
we can beat. But if you watch the film closely, it can also be read as this is both a warning against communist infiltration, and it's also possibly, well, isn't this better for us to be infiltrated by communists? Because look how happy we are. Look how peaceful we are. There's no war. There's no famine. There's no
strife.
disease. There's no strife.
Oh, God.
And that's why this story can be always read two ways, which makes it continually fascinating to me. And then in the 70s, it was remade in 1978. My favorite version, Invasion of the Body Snatchers by Philip Kaufman, which takes the action to San Francisco. So it takes it from a small town into a metropolitan area in the post-hippie era when everyone is into self-help. And they're already working on trying to change themselves because everyone's unhappy. It's like, how can I be happy? Can I do yoga? Can I do est? Leonard Nimoy is in it as a psychiatrist.
I loved it, yes.
Oh.
Well, because I totally forgot about that. He's the author.
He's the author of the
Yeah.
book, a self-help book that everyone in San Francisco is reading. And so he becomes a great conduit for the pod people to teach his patients how to be pod people, basically. And Donald Sutherland and Brooke Adams and Jeff Goldblum
And if you've ever had a friend or a relative that has gone into one of those cult-like self-helpy things, you understand the idea that,
Yes.
oh, you sound like you're a pod person.
yes, and that entered the vernacular. You're a pod person, meaning you're just saying what everyone tells you to say, and you're not thinking and you're not feeling. Interesting, this version, the 78 version of Body Snatchers came out 1 month after the Jonestown Massacre, the Reverend Jim Jones Massacre.
I didn't know that. Timeline. Good.
Which I think, looking back, people have said, well, that gave that film so much resonance because the people that were involved in the Jonestown Massacre, who went to Guyana, were mostly from San Francisco.
Oh, yeah.
And it was these people who were desperately searching for meaning and falling into cults, which was a big thing in the 70s. So again, this movie somehow managed to hit that zeitgeist of cults and this need for self-reinvention. And it's also really creepy and scary. There's a scene where a homeless man and a dog fall asleep next to each other, next to a pod, and it melds the two bodies. So the dog has the man's face, but it has the dog's tongue out of its mouth. And
If you need to go see the scenes where they show the pods and the little baby people growing out of the pods. I like when I was watching it, I was like, I let a little scream out because I was like, oh my God, that
yeah.
whoever was in charge of those special effects was genius because it's so creepy and gross.
Yeah, you actually see the pods giving birth, whereas in the original they were sort of like corn husks.
Yeah.
But here
It
they're
was
actually
so
giving
creepy.
like gory, bloody birth.
And you hear like it's just gross.
And when Donald Sutherland finds his duplicate being made, he wakes up and then smashes its head in with a garden hoe. Horrible. But where this movie diverged is that they were able, because it's the 70s, you can have a very pessimistic, cynical ending. Won't reveal in case people, of course, haven't seen it. But that sort of set the tone for the other two adaptations and remakes of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. One from 1993 called Body Snatchers by Abel Ferrara, who did Ms. 45 and King of New York and Driller Killer. And this one was set on a military base in Alabama. And it's about someone from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, coming to this military base to discover what sorts of environmental impact the military is having because they're dumping things into the rivers. So it sort of gets into like an eco-horror theme. But the pods decide that the best way to take over the planet is to take over military bases.
Which makes sense.
Yes. And I think it's easy to see that the conformity of the army could be a very obvious metaphor for the conformity of pod people. And so this film really exploits that kind of paranoia that is the military acting as sort of a hive mentality, and they're all one mind and working for the government. And so there's a lot of paranoia in the film. And Meg Tilly is in it, who I love too, and she gives a terrifying performance. And this film is focused on a teenage girl whose family moves to the military base, and she's the one that uncovers what's going on.
Well,
So
that's
it's-
an interesting take.
yeah, so it's sort of a different perspective. And then the most current and the most recent version of the film was from 2007, called The Invasion, which was directed by Oliver Hirschbiegel, who's a German director, who's sort of an art house director who did The Experiment and a lot of films like that. This was his first Hollywood film. It stars Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig, and here the action has been moved to Washington, D.C. Nicole Kidman is I know where the pod people have already taken over. We know she's a psychiatrist, Nicole Kidman, so she's the hero of the film, and she's the one that starts discovering her patients are having he's my husband, but he's not my husband, and her patient who thinks this is Veronica Cartwright from the 1978 version, which is kind of a nice callback to that film. And Daniel Craig is Nicole Kidman's boyfriend, who's a doctor, and they sort of start working together to figure out what's happening. But the pods are basically infiltrating the world via a pandemic. So people think this is like a SARS-like virus that's taking people over.
That's timely. Yeah.
Yes. So at the time, this came out right after the SARS panic.
H1N1 and
yes,
avian
bird flu,
whatever.
Ebola. So that was the kind of social anxiety that it was sort of exploiting at the time. But here it's a global phenomenon, and the pods decide that the best way is to get people because here in this version, to spread the podism, they actually inject you with glandular fluid from their mouth, so they're spitting in each other's mouths. It's disgusting.
Oh, God.
It's disgusting.
Do you see that they
Yes.
do that?
Oh, yes.
Ew.
So
Maybe I don't need to see it. No, I'll watch it.
So the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, who has been taken over by the pods, decides the best way is to fool people into thinking it's a flu epidemic. So everyone has to go get inoculated. They end up just spitting in their mouths
Oh,
my gosh.
Louise.
when they
I'm so
go get
grossed out.
inoculated. So it's kind of great, and it's
Oh, it gave fodder for all those people who are anti-vaxxers.
this is the anti-vax
Oh
movie
my
for
God,
sure.
that's horrible, but gross.
Yeah. So again, it exploits that current anxiety. What's interesting is that Oliver Hirschbiegel actually made an art film, but Warner Brothers wanted a big summer action film. And it was produced by Joel Silver, who did the Lethal Weapon films. And so when he saw that the film was like an art film, he had the Wachowskis, who did The Matrix,
Had no idea.
come in and rewrite the film. So they rewrote like 2/3 of the movie to be more action oriented, and they had someone else
Poor
come in
guy.
and reshoot like car chases and
That
helicopter
would've broke
chases.
my heart if I was that guy.
Oh boy. So it doesn't really work because they tried to make it into a summer action film because it came out in August of that year, and
That's a bummer.
so they kind of got rid of some of the more interesting elements, kept all the spitting in,
Oh!
added some car chases. But it still like gets to the heart of what makes us nervous at that time, which at the time was
Right.
disease and bio-warfare
Yep,
and
I remember when
pandemics.
that, yeah, it
and
wasn't that long ago.
And the movie Outbreak came out around the same time with Dustin Hoffman.
Zombies started becoming a big thing.
Oh yeah,
Zombies were a big thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the last technical remake of Body Snatchers. It's influenced a lot of films like The Stepford Wives and a lot of films. It's been reported that so Warner Brothers, who owns the rights to the whole franchise, is working on another remake. I don't know what the anxiety is, but I feel like it should be social media. Because if you can't think of the pod people taking over people through social media,
Right.
then you're not thinking hard enough. Because
Or
clearly,
the advertisements on social media.
yeah, it's almost too easy of a metaphor. But
Oh right.
I mean, we've kind of been turned into pod people by social media. I mean, let's just be honest.
Well, especially if you don't take a second to critically analyze.
If you're not critically thinking
that
about what you're
thing, and I'm
consuming,
like, oh God.
Yes.
Or your phone in general.
your phone, yeah, exactly.
Just your phone.
Yes, I think this is how the pods are going to get to us is through the phones. I would hope that that's what this new version is.
More fodder for people to give youth shit about.
That's-
Staring at their phones all the time, which drives me crazy because it just is what it is.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I get that we definitely all could use some less phone time, but stop giving the youth crap about it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, the boomers are turned into pod people by social media
Oh,
too.
don't
I mean,
get
it's
me
not just
started on the
kids.
boomers. half of the people who are complaining are Gen Xers that are just old and on the cusp, and they think that they're still cool, but they're boomers. Anyways, you can delete that part. Generational, like it frustrates me. Generational, like stop criticizing each other's generations and just keep on.
Yeah, I mean, if we should be critical of anything, it's the technology itself and how it affects humanity, not generations.
Right.
Because
Sure.
because everyone uses social media.
When I'm in the lobby, half of them are grown-ups that have gray hair
Heck yeah.
that are they're staring at their phones.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I think anyways, it's just anyways.
Well, and I mean, this is such a tangent, but
Right.
do you remember, I mean, as a Gen Xer, I remember being a 20-something Gen Xer and being told we're all slackers
Yep. Mhm.
and we don't work.
That's right.
You know what I mean? It's being
just
20
the same. And it's
in the
and
modern day.
Yeah, it's just like letting the media have a story.
Yeah.
Right.
It really is media creating a story over generations and creating this strife
Right.
and people fall for it. I mean, my family
Yeah.
falls for it. I see them talk shit about millennials and all the time, and I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, shut up.
It just came up with my neighbor recently. He was like, "Oh, these millennials, they just don't have the work ethic."
And I'm like,
Yeah.
you just meet the wrong ones.
Yeah,
Because
'cause I've
for
met 'em
every
that
one
are-
that you don't like, there's another one that's awesome.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
anyways,
Without a
tangent.
doubt.
Sorry.
Well, maybe the boomers will be the aliens who are
Well,
changing
I mean,
the young people into
related
pod
to
people.
the invasion of the Body Snatchers, that is a cool way to kind of tell about generations. Those versions of,
Yeah. Yeah, and if you think about the way that all people, not just young people, but all people sort of create online identities for themselves through Instagram and whatnot.
sure.
I mean, that's a very easily adaptable metaphor to the pod person body snatchers.
Instagram for sure.
Yeah, kind of theme. So I think it could be a very rich
Could be.
vein for them to
Someone
mine
get
for
on
this.
it if they're not already.
Let's get on this. Okay.
You know, I just want to point out that in talking about these, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, these all came from books. They've been remade, but not just that everybody knows it, but how much it's creeped into our language, right? Like with what I started out with, the Children of the Night, you know, and the notion of pod people, right? Like that's something that everybody's used. Bah humbug. That's something that these things have become so ingrained in our culture, and you can't say A Christmas Carol or Scrooge and not come up with those three ghosts, and I mean so much of it, and the notion of the stake through the heart, and just all of this lore. It's really interesting how ingrained in our culture it's become.
Yeah.
And hence the reason it's made over and over again, and why
Yeah.
people look at it.
Yeah. I don't want to make too grandiose a statement, but I feel like these are sort of like the modern day myths. These are like the Greek. These are like the Greek mythological stories of the modern era.
Yeah.
Their
Agreed.
their movies, their books, their literature.
And you should Google it. The most remade movies out there. There's very interesting movies on the list. Not 100% literary, but I believe about the top 8 or so are literary. So just take a look and watch some of those. Watch some of the ones that we mentioned,
And read a book.
and read a book.
How fun is that?
Yeah.
Go back and read the source novel. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a great excuse to read a novel.
I really had a fun time doing that.
Yeah.
And this has been one of the ones where I've immersed myself the most is in making this episode and watching all the Dracula films. And I mean, I really was, there were a couple weeks there where it was Dracula
Ooh.
centric at my house.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed it.
Did your family worry about you?
I think they should.
He's really into Dracula.
It's a lot of blood. That's
Yeah.
My mother-in-law's like, that's a lot of blood you've been watching.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, that's for a thing. I got to do it.
Why is my husband lurking in the shadows? Like,
He's sharpening his teeth.
I sleep with a seed pod in my bed every night. Join us. So this is great. So yeah, I think there's lots of films for people to watch. You could take
Yep.
any one of these and watch numerous
Plus
versions
more.
of them.
Yep.
So that's great. Thank you, Heather and Rusty.
Oh,
Thanks,
yeah.
It's very
Jeff.
exciting. Yes. So the end of this podcast brings me to rule number 814 of the Mini Rules of Film Club, which is a decade is a time to reflect. And so as we approach the year 2020, next time on the Mini Rules of Film Club, we're going to be looking at the best and maybe the worst depending, films
favorites.
of the 2010s. Yes, our favorites. Our favorite films of the 2010s. So that's the next time on the Many Rules of Film Club. And in the meantime, please check us out everywhere on Facebook, on our YouTube channel, our new YouTube channel, Many Rules of Film Club, on iTunes, our website, themanyrulesofilmclub.com. Rate us, give us your opinions, your feelings.
Drop us a line on Facebook, anything.
Well, we'll see you next time on the Many Rules of Film Club. Thanks for listening.